Dame Stephanie Shirley has had an incredible life. Best known as a multi-millionaire philanthropist, she's given more than £65 million to charities mainly focused on autism. That following her being a mother of an autistic child who needed several years of institutionalisation. Dame Stephanie, hello.
Nice to be here.
We're going to talk about all of that, but I want to begin just briefly on your early life. You were born in 1933 in Germany into a Jewish family just a few months after the rise of Hitler. That must have had a profound impact on not only that time but the rest of your life too.
Well, I feel a very lucky guy because I arrived in this country in 1939, 5-year-old, clutching the hand of my 9-year-old sister, and settled here and have become more English than the English, I think. But it left me with a very strong feeling that I needed to make the life that was saved worth saving. And so I try not to fritter my days away, and I try to contribute to the world, originally through my information technology, but nowadays entirely through the philanthropy, the money that I made in the computer industry. And it's left me with also a patriotism. I love this country with the passion that perhaps only someone who has lost their human rights can feel. And it certainly makes me what I am and drives me from today to tomorrow.
And I understand that you had what might have been your first encounter with autism at that time through your father.
Well, Guy, I'm not sure that it was the first contact. It was just as I got to know more about autism and about how strongly heritable it is, I also realised, my father, I wonder if he had some autistic, well, he certainly had some autistic qualities. He was a brilliant man. He was a High Court judge at the age of 30. He played the violin, spoke 7 languages. But he had a sort of oddness to him, a bit of quirkiness. He enjoyed railway timetables. Now that sounds very, very familiar to many autistic families. And so I look back and I sort of think, well, perhaps there was something there.
You settled in this country. You excelled at maths and IT when you were at work, and you actually started at your own company, which you continued running and continued to build up after the birth of your son, Giles. After a while, you noticed something wasn't quite as you'd expected with Giles.
Well, Giles was a beautiful baby, and I know every mother says that. But he was lovely, and at first I thought we were doing rather well. And I was conscious that a mathematical background was not perhaps the most family-friendly thing, but I think it was a warm and loving family. But then I began to realise that he was learning disabled. He was slow in talking, slow in walking, and even to a first-time mother, I knew something was wrong. But every day was happy, and we were moving forward, and he was doing new things. But then at 2.5, something really dreadful happened, and it's called regression. But suddenly he was no longer learning, he was no longer doing new things, but he was actually losing skills. And over a very short period, he lost speech, and he never spoke again. And we were warned that maybe he would lose other senses. So it was a pretty worrying time. Eventually, of course, we learnt that he was profoundly autistic, and have learnt that a lot about autism. Autism is now how I spend my life. I try to professionalise what I learnt as a mother in very difficult years. Giles was institutionalised at the age of 13. I try to modify that and use my analytic capabilities to impact a lot of people. So I'm not just helping myself, I'm helping a lot of people. And that strategy has taken me to about 70 different projects in the autism field, the most recent of which is a project about getting autistic people into work, the biggest of which is a big school, the Proudest, which has about 100 pupils modelled on my Jazi. And the most strategic, perhaps, is a medical research into autism. So I really spend my time. Are there new things I could do? Is there some way in which to leverage this? Oh, well, I've started the all-party parliamentary group on autism, and I've started music for autism. I've started, there's things that I have been able to do that make an impact and that gives me my purpose in life.
Mm. Your description of Giles's regression is something that many people watching this will recognise from their own stories. How did you cope with that at the time? What did you do, and what would you advise parents today to do in such situations?
I wish I were qualified to advise parents. I know what I did, and that is, to begin with, I ignored it. I pretended that it hadn't happened because I hadn't really come to terms with it. Then I suppose I became more realistic about it and got some help from professionals. I didn't get much help, to be honest. I eventually finished up in a diagnostic hospital with him, and I was trying to run my business from its mother's unit, so that was not a good period either. But they came up with a prognosis that was so awful that I asked for a second opinion, and we finished up with Great Ormond Street Hospital, a wonderful, wonderful hospital that now has some autistic focus, because they really help autistic patients in many ways. So it was not a good period, but eventually, I suppose, we became accepting of autism. We were talking earlier, Guy, about my Jewish background, and things were very different 55 years ago when Giles was young. And in fact, at one time it was thought that autism was correlated with Judaism.
Is that right?
Yes. At one time we thought it was correlated with things such as all the electronics that we use. Another time it was thought to be concerned with vaccines. There have been a host of suggestions as to what is behind this. And basically we don't know. There's some things we do know. It is about 120 genes are involved at a minimum. So we're talking about hundreds of genes. This is not something that, as I hoped, we would find an early solution to. We've also learned, I suppose, that maybe we don't need a solution. Maybe we should just learn to accept people with autism for what they are and the skills that they've got. And that's been a real social change, as distinct from, seeing autism as the things that he doesn't speak, he doesn't do this, he doesn't do that. Because he has other skills. And
I guess that sort of thinking, that sort of attitude probably wasn't even available to you at that time.
I was ashamed. I found that, is it something that I've done? In those days, the mothers in particular were openly criticised for somehow not having brought our children up properly. And that hurt. One of my charities is doing a study at Hertfordshire University on the impact of stigma on families with autism. And there were all sorts of really painful things that went on then. My mother-in-law didn't want us to bring Giles to her home because people would see that there was something wrong. Those sorts of attitudes to various conditions were very different in my day, and I must say they have much improved now.
Though there is still a high degree of misunderstanding that parents of autistic children often face from their own families and people close to them, their friends, not understanding, the reality of their own children.
But I don't think anybody realises quite how much care and love that they do need, and how you have to listen very carefully to this non-communicating child to find out what is going on. The amount of care with Giles was, I got a grant to help with some of the costs. I once got local authority took him in for a fortnight to give us a break, and that was a disaster because it gave us a break, but Giles was acutely unhappy and burst into tears when we appeared again, which is the first time was the only time I've ever seen him in tears. Oh. So there were all sorts of really dreadful, painful things that went on in the family. But eventually, as he got older, I did get him some schooling. He was classed as ineducable. In other words, he came under health rather than education. But I did get him some early primary schooling. Sadly, he did finish up in hospital in a locked ward with 15 other profoundly vulnerable children. And that was fine to a certain extent. And for many years, we were able to recover and get our own personalities and life back. But then things started to go wrong, and just as I had lost human rights in Germany, so he began to lose human rights in the hospital. And by that time, my business was a lot more successful, and so we decided to take him out of the hospital. Luckily, he was not sectioned, and look after him again ourselves, this time with paid help. And that grew into my first charity, of which I'm enormously proud, called Autism at Kingwood. Kingwood was the place where it started. And I'm enormously proud that that charity eventually became independent financially and managerially of me, and now runs professionally. It looks after 143 adults like Giles, very difficult, many without speech, very profoundly, lot of distress behaviour. When they're successful, I mean, we've had somebody, for example, start to speak at the age of 24. Now, that is simply because they lived with Kingwood for a long time. It was all structured. They really began to feel content and happy and were able to start a little bit of speech.
Was it more difficult when he was at that older age and he came back to live with you at that time?
As he got bigger, it was no longer possible to sort of pick him up and tuck him under my arm to get him out of danger. He had no sense of danger. And when puberty hit, far too early at the age of 11, he started to have epileptic seizures. And my husband found those more worrying than I did. To me, that was just a very mechanistic, it's a medical problem. I just have to deal with it. And I eventually got it under control, so he had two fits a year, that sort of thing. However, it did kill him. He died of an epileptic seizure, or during an epileptic seizure. So you can't really take an individual story out of context. My husband moved his job to be nearby in order to help me. He then took early retirement. My sister came from Australia to help me. So the whole family really was very supportive, but it still failed, and we couldn't do it. And the understanding that the responsibility for such a acutely sensitive child is just overwhelming. And as I say, he finished up in hospital.
And again, that idea of the sensitivity and the need to really respect that and look after the child will resonate with a lot of parents as well. Before that happened, though, and after he came out of the institution and he was with you in a cottage that you purchased for him, how did you find that he changed in that family and that sort of closer environment as opposed to being in the institution?
It took 6 years to deinstitutionalize him, and that's a long time. And eventually he learnt to feel happy in his own skin again, and start to live a quiet, dignified life in the community. So it finished up as a success story with enormous pain and enormous cost. The cost of autism to the family, financial cost to the family and to the state is ginormous. And people have to remember that as well.
But he became happier during that time?
Infinitely so. He still had meltdowns, but he learnt to deal with them. I eventually started to employ professional staff, and they were able to get him to, for example, if he had a meltdown, to just to lie quietly on the floor. And he would do it himself. And then when he was calm, he would get up again. Now that sort of thing, it takes years to get him to do something.
But he was learning to self-regulate.
He was learning to self-regulate. I haven't got all the words, yes.
What do you learn from that situation about the importance of the environment around an autistic child?
I think if I could have got that sort of environment for him right from the early days, life might have been very different for him. In fact, we led a quiet, stable life, but it wasn't either as stable or as structured as perhaps I would have liked for him in retrospect. So it's an enormous impact of the surroundings in order to get him comfortable, happy.
And what would you say with the, I'm thinking of any parents who might be watching this, what are the key elements of a healthy environment for an autistic child, would you say?
Well, the key elements of a healthy environment for an autistic child may be something that the parents really cannot cope with. We can't live in a sterile environment. There are other members of the family. My mother-in-law was dying, and all those sorts of things that happen in any family. But what one tried to do for Giles was keep a pattern of that he knew what was happening, he knew what was going to happen, he had a choice as to what was going to happen, his wishes were met to a very large extent, but you can't meet all the wishes. So it's a bit unrealistic, but structure, stimulation, at the same time calm, regularity, going to bed at the same time every day, and that sort of thing.
Love and understanding, it sounds like, as well.
Well, yes, indeed, that comes first.
A little earlier than that, you talked about when, after he left the nursery school and came back to live with you, and his epilepsy began. That must have been a very difficult time for you. How did you cope with that, and how would you advise other parents to possibly cope with a situation like that?
Well, looking back, I don't think I coped very well. We continued to look after him ourselves, and it just became worse and worse. And eventually I was unable to function at all. So I talk now about needing a healthy selfishness to look after myself, mind, body and spirit, in order to continue the loving relationship. Because once I ceased to function, I wasn't any use to anybody.
Yeah.
And that's a hard lesson to learn, that we actually have to be a little bit selfish. There may be time to get support, help. I wouldn't like to look back to those days.
Can we move to your philanthropic activity?
With pleasure.
Because I think that in recent years, it's interesting to remember that you didn't have wealth for most of your life, or significant wealth. It came
Much
really
later.
in your much later years. What is it that that inspired you to want to give away most of that wealth?
I think with an autistic child, if we were going to go on caring for him, even when he was institutionalized, we saw him each week a couple of times, your life is restricted in a certain extent, and you have to come to terms with that. That we were not going to get a yacht and sail around the world or anything like that. I think the impoverished life that I had early on made me not willing to really throw money and start living in a different sort of lifestyle. There's such needs in the world that the whole idea of philanthropy is trying to make the world a bit fairer. If I have a lot of wealth, I can share it. I shared my company with the staff. I shared my wealth with the autism sector. I fed some of it back into the IT sector because that seemed right and proper, because that's where the wealth came from. But I also extended it from looking after Giles and people like him to all sorts of ways in which a businesswoman could contribute to the autism sector. I'm good at starting things. So I've started several charities, most of which have survived. I've started several projects like the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Autism, Music for Autism. I was involved in the early days of Treehouse. They've now changed their name. But I was able to sort of think of the things that I would have liked for Giles and try and provide them for other people. And that has given me contentment in my life. I'm now quite a happy person. And I'm now a very happy person. Because I have the things that I can do that... And philanthropy is... It's not giving. It's actually partnering with other people to make things happen, it's a reciprocal relationship. The pleasure that I get from some of my projects completely balances the paltry sums of money that I put in. And I never just write a check. I always get involved with contacts, with relationships, with money, sure. But everybody can be a philanthropist. You don't need to have serious money.
Did you have anything specific that you wanted to achieve with your philanthropy, or any particular areas where you've wanted to focus?
I set as a mission to concentrate on strategic issues that were not just helping a few children, a few adults, a few parents, but actually made some difference to the sector. And I never support something that, I'm a pioneer. I start things. If something exists, I will try and make it better. I won't start another one. So that was partly the aim, to contribute to the sector in that way. When it came to medical research, I set, about the year 2000, I set a target of which I'm now ashamed, because I said my aim for the next decade or so is going to be to understand the causes of autism by 2012 and halve the global cost of the condition by 2020. Now, 2012 was deferred to 2014, And now, of course, I know better because we're all on a journey. We learn as we go along. And I now know that what we need to do is make life better for those with autism, including their families. Halve the global cost of autism by 2020, that is still achievable. People with severe autism can learn to operate at a much higher level. Rather than being institutionalized, they will get into work, modest work perhaps, animal husbandry, cleaning the vegetables in the kitchen. These sorts of jobs are very suitable, the calm, working in the fields and so on, and there are still jobs like that. So I became if we can get people into work, into wealth creation, as distinct from on benefits, it makes a lot of difference to the cost of autism in the sector. Cost to the country, Britain, is currently 32 billion a year. Now, that's a monstrous amount, and that really needs to come down. And it mainly is going to come down through better health, early intervention, and employment. And that was why we did a 3-year study on how to get people with autism into employment. And this book came out last month, which is September 2018, and talks about the sort of jobs that my Giles could have had and the sort of jobs that people with bright, computer science from Yale University or something like that, what's open to them. The world is now open.
What is the achievement in your philanthropy that you're proudest of?
I think the medical research one is the most strategic. It set up an autism brain bank in Oxford that is now the largest brain bank in the world because the American brain bank failed. It's very important for researchers to have access to post-mortem material. And that's still true today, even when we have MRI studies. But also it has this aim of long, healthy, happy lives for people with autism. It set up fellowships in Nottingham, Newcastle, Cambridge, King's College, London. These are a sort of real in-depth research where any long-term solutions, any long-term impact is going to come from the research sector. So I'm most proud of that. The one that gives me most pleasure is the school. It has about 90 pupils, again modelled on my Giles, so very, very difficult pupils. Takes them in at the age of 5. Now most local authorities don't want to pay the sort of sums that, the fees that are necessary. And to 18, and then there's a young adult centre, 19 to 25 for some people as well, which also takes in people from outside. 90 pupils, over 600 staff, 2 teaching robots. It really is the school that I would have liked for my Gilesy in terms of physical, intellectual and spiritual development. It's near Newbury, it has 55 acres, it is 52 weeks in a year. The teaching is superb. I mean, the staff are just wonderful. And it's done lovingly, and it's like a little community. Very professional with that number of staff, headed nowadays by a businessman. First head was an educationalist, second head was an autistic person, not focused on education, because they're 24 hours in the day, and education is only part of our young people's lives.
And the Kingswood Trust, of course.
Yes, Autism at Kingwood is... it was probably the most painful one because I was working on that, physically to set up houses and furnish them and get them going and recruiting staff. But mainly I was limited by cost in those days. I was having to dribble money in while the family was sort of saying, but we need a better car and this sort of thing. So it was really cost me much more.
Yes.
And that's why it took me a long time to get that established.
You mentioned early intervention before, and of course that's the area that our charity is very, very much focused on.
Absolutely marvellous.
Could you say a little about why you think specifically early intervention is important?
Well, you'll think me very tough, but I mean, early intervention pays for itself financially. If you can intervene in those early years, the whole of life opens up. And if for whatever reason you can't, or you don't know that it's necessary, or you choose to completely ignore somebody else's needs, then the costs, emotional and financial, are going to come much later. And so by intervening early, as I understand, what you're aiming to do is to really bring these children through so that they can have a better chance of more appropriate schooling and full and happy lives.
Yeah. What would you say, from your experience as an autistic mother and from your experience as a philanthropist, what are the main things that you've learnt about autism? Big question.
Interestingly, you talk about me as an autistic mother, because that is just what happens with an autistic member in the family. The whole family becomes autistic. You lose your casual friends. You have a different approach to how your own life leads. In the 50-odd years since I've been involved with autism, I suppose I've learnt not to think of it as a medical problem, but as a social problem. And that's a big change in that. And also to respect people with autism, to listen to them. One of my recent projects is to set up what's called the National Autistic Task Force, and that is giving funds to people with autism to do what they think is necessary for the autistic sector, not, the very conceitful thing, oh, I know what is needed. Now, at one time, perhaps I did know one or two things that were needed, and I did them, but now it's so sophisticated. I think really people can decide themselves what they want to do.
And I understand you're having a proper retirement soon. Is that right?
Yes. I've been working as what's called a venture philanthropist. I set up projects, I conceive them, I staff them, I fund them, I take them to sustainability. And I find I'm no longer able to do that. And I don't want to be a philanthropist who just writes checks. So I'm doing what is called spending out. I'm spending out the charity this month. So the Shirley Foundation will cease to exist in a few weeks' time. The spending out refers to giving all the assets of the charity, which are still considerable, to outside. And in fact, I've decided to give it all to Autistica, which we set up. It is the most strategic. It is the one I'm most proud of. It has a fantastically clever scientific advisory board. It's professionally managed. I'm really very happy with it. And so they will be carrying on the medical research work with the cash that I'm providing.
So what does the future hold? Will you be able to just rest and relax?
No, I don't. I don't think so. I'm doing a lot of speaking now, not necessarily for autism, occasionally for autism. But it allows me to fundraise, in fact, for Autistica, so that whenever I'm speaking, if I get a fee, that goes to Autistica. So it's quite nice still to be earning at my age, and I enjoy that.
Dame Stephanie, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.